What happens when an entire galactic civilization underestimates the quiet species from a small blue planet? When mockery turns to silence and laughter becomes fear. The Galactic Council thought they knew everything about warfare, diplomacy, and power. They had conquered thousands of worlds, absorbed countless species, and built an empire spanning half the galaxy. Humans were just another primitive species to them, weak, emotional, and utterly insignificant. But they made one critical error. They mistook humanity's restraint for weakness, our diplomacy for cowardice, and our silence for submission. When the Council's arrogance finally pushed too far, they discovered that some sleeping giants should never be awakened. This is the story of what happened when humanity stopped talking and started moving. When the galaxy's greatest predators learned they were never at the top of the food chain. When the Council's laughter died in their throats as they realized their fatal mistake. Sometimes the most dangerous response isn't a roar, it's deadly silence. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood motionless in the center of the Galactic Council's grand chamber, her hands clasped behind her back as waves of mocking laughter echoed off the crystalline walls. The sound bounced from one species to another. The chittering of the insectoid Zephyrians, the rumbling chuckles of the massive Gorvani, and the high-pitched squeaks of the amphibian Quillari. Each council member seemed to be trying to outdo the others in displaying their amusement at humanity's latest request. Territorial rights, wheezed Councillor Vextar, his 4 eyes streaming with what passed for tears among his people. The humans want territorial rights. His translation device struggled to convert his species' laughter into something recognizable to the gathered delegates. High Councillor Rathmok, a towering Gorvani whose purple hide was marked with the scars of a dozen conquests, slammed his massive fist on the curved table that dominated the chamber's center. "This is rich, even for these primitives," he boomed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally overseen the subjugation of 43 worlds. They've been in space for what, 200 of their pathetic years? And they think they can claim territory in our galaxy. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral as she watched the display. Her dark eyes moved methodically from one council member to another, cataloging their reactions, their body language, their tells. 20 years of diplomatic service had taught her patience. More importantly, it had taught her when patience was about to run out. Councillor Rathmok raises an excellent point, interjected Zilthara, the Quillari representative whose wet, bulbous skin glistened under the chamber's artificial suns. Humans have barely managed to establish colonies on a dozen worlds. Meanwhile, the Gorvani Empire spans 800 systems. The Zephyrian Collective controls over 600, and even the smallest council member nations possess more territory than humanity could dream of governing. The Zephyrian representative, a creature that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a spider, clicked his mandibles in what his people considered polite agreement. The collective concurs. Perhaps we should be discussing humanity's integration into an existing territorial framework rather than indulging these fantasies of independent governance. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the curved table, 47 different species were represented, each one bringing their own unique perspective on galactic politics. What they all shared was a fundamental belief that humanity was too young, too weak, and too naive to be taken seriously. It was a belief that had been reinforced over the past 50 years as human diplomatic missions consistently sought peaceful solutions to territorial disputes, honored ceasefires even when their enemies didn't, and refused to engage in the kind of aggressive expansion that every other council member took for granted. Ambassador Chun, High Councillor Rathmok said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone usually reserved for addressing children or domesticated animals. Surely your government understands that territorial claims must be backed by the ability to defend them? What military might does humanity possess that would discourage, say, the Draconian Empire from simply taking whatever worlds you claim? The Draconian representative, a massive reptilian creature whose scales shifted color based on his emotional state, hissed softly in amusement. The Draconian Empire has been wondering the same thing. Perhaps humanity would be interested in a protection arrangement? We could safeguard your colonies for a modest tribute, say 60% of your world's gross output. More laughter rippled through the chamber. Sarah could feel the eyes of the gallery upon her, where representatives from hundreds of smaller species watched the proceedings. Some looked sympathetic to humanity's plight, but most seemed to view this as entertainment. The newcomer species getting put in their place by their betters. The human military, said Counselor Vextar, consulting a data pad with exaggerated care, consists of approximately 12 million active personnel across all branches. They possess roughly 800 interstellar vessels, most of which are classified as frigates or destroyers by galactic standards. He paused for effect. For comparison, the Zephyrian Collective maintains a standing military force of 8 billion warriors and possesses over 40,000 capital ships. Don't forget their advanced weaponry, added Zilthara with mock seriousness. Kinetic projectiles, chemical explosives, and what they charmingly call nuclear weapons. How delightfully primitive. Sarah finally spoke, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. The Terran Federation respectfully maintains its request for recognized territorial sovereignty over the systems we have lawfully colonized through exploration and settlement. The chamber fell silent for a moment, then erupted in even louder laughter. High Counselor Rathmok wiped his eyes with one massive hand. Lawfully colonized? Child, there is only one law in this galaxy. The strong take what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Your species hasn't learned this lesson yet because you've been fortunate enough to expand into empty systems. But empty systems are becoming scarce. Indeed, said the Draconian representative, his scales now shifting to a deep red that indicated aggressive interest. The systems humanity currently occupies contain several worlds rich in quantum crystals. The Draconian Empire has need of those crystals. We were simply being polite by offering a protection arrangement. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in the air seemed to shift. The temperature in the chamber didn't drop, but several of the more sensitive species suddenly felt an inexplicable chill run down their spines. Ambassador Esikatar, she said, addressing the Draconian directly. Are you suggesting that the Draconian Empire intends to take Terran worlds by force? Esikatar's scales brightened to a brilliant scarlet as he leaned forward. I am stating it plainly, little mammal. Your species has three choices: submit to Draconian protection, abandon your colonies, and retreat to your homeworld, or watch your settlements burn. We give you this choice out of respect for the Council's protocols, nothing more. The chamber erupted in excited chatter. This was unexpected. Most territorial disputes were settled through complex negotiations that could take decades to resolve. The Draconians were known for their directness, but even by their standards, this was remarkably blunt. High Counselor Rathmok called for order with another slam of his fist. The Council recognizes Ambassador Esikatar's right to make such claims under the Territorial Acquisition Protocols. Ambassador Chun, how does the Terran Federation respond to this challenge? For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. She stood in perfect silence, her hands still clasped behind her back, her breathing steady and controlled. Around the chamber, delegates leaned forward in anticipation. Some expected her to back down immediately. Humans were notorious for avoiding direct confrontation. Others thought she might make an impassioned plea for council intervention, though everyone knew such pleas rarely succeeded. None of them expected what actually happened. The Terran Federation, Sarah said quietly, declines. The silence that followed was so complete that the chamber's environmental systems seemed suddenly loud in comparison. It was Counselor Vextar who finally spoke. Declines what exactly? All three options, Sarah replied with the same deadly calm. We decline to submit. We decline to abandon our rightful territories. And we decline to watch our settlements burn. Esikatar's scales turned nearly black with rage. Then, you choose war, little mammal. Your species will learn what happens when insects try to sting dragons. Sarah turned to face him directly for the first time. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that none of the delegates had heard before. Ambassador Esikatar, your people have a saying. The wise hunter studies his prey before the strike. Perhaps you should have studied more carefully. Are you threatening a council member? High Counselor Rathmok demanded, though there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to hear the answer. The Terran Federation has no quarrel with the council, Sarah replied. her gaze still locked on the Draconian representative. Our quarrel is with those who mistake restraint for weakness, diplomacy for cowardice, and silence for submission. She took a single step forward, and somehow that small movement seemed to change everything about her presence in the chamber. Where before she had appeared as a lone figure surrounded by more powerful enemies, now she seemed to fill the space around her with something dark and patient and utterly implacable. For 50 years, she continued, humanity has sought peaceful coexistence with our galactic neighbors. We have honored treaties that others broke. We have sought diplomatic solutions when others chose violence. We have shown restraint when others showed aggression. And, in return, we have been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of Zilthara's nervous breathing was audible throughout the space. But restraint, Sarah said, should never be mistaken for inability. Sektar rose to his full height, nearly 3 meters of muscle and scales and barely controlled fury. Enough of this posturing. The Draconian Empire claims the human worlds. Let them object with their pathetic fleet if they dare. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. It was not a pleasant expression. Very well, she said. The Terran Federation formally rejects the Draconian Empire's claims and will defend its territorial sovereignty by any means necessary. The formal language might have sounded like standard diplomatic protocol, but something about the way she said it sent a collective shiver through the assembled delegates. Councillor Vextar, whose species had evolved from ambush predators, felt his ancient instincts suddenly, screaming warnings about the small human female standing before them. High Councillor Rathmach gavelled the session to a close with unnecessary force. The territorial acquisition protocols are hereby invoked. The Draconian Empire has 60 standard galactic days to present evidence of their ability to enforce their claims. The Terran Federation has the same period to demonstrate their ability to defend their territory. The Council will reconvene at the end of this period to witness the resolution. As the delegates began to file out, chattering excitedly about the unexpected drama, Sarah remained motionless in the center of the chamber. She waited until the last of the council members had left before finally turning to go. As she walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the now empty space, she touched the small communication device hidden beneath her collar. Transmission commence, she said quietly. Authorization Chin 77 Alpha. Priority Alpha. Message begins. The diplomacy phase is concluded. Recommend implementation of Protocol 7. Time frame, 60 days. Message ends. As the chamber's great doors closed behind her, none of the lingering staff noticed that the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped several degrees. And none of them could have guessed that across human space, in facilities buried deep beneath the surfaces of a dozen worlds, things that had been sleeping in darkness for 50 years were beginning to wake up. The Draconian Empire was about to learn why humanity had spent 5 decades building a reputation for restraint and diplomacy. They were about to discover that some lessons can only be taught once. And they were about to understand the difference between a species that couldn't fight and a species that chose not to. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the TNS Defiance, watching through the massive view screen as the Draconian fleet approached New Geneva. The enemy formation was impressive by any galactic standard. 200 capital ships arranged in the traditional Draconian battle formation that had conquered 43 worlds over the past century. Each vessel was a kilometer or more in length, bristling with plasma cannons and quantum torpedo launchers that could reduce a planet's surface to molten glass within hours. Admiral, called Commander Zhang from the communication station, we're receiving a transmission from the Draconian flagship. Admiral Crothven is demanding our immediate surrender. Elena didn't turn away from the view screen. The Draconian fleet hung in space like a collection of predatory fish, their dark hulls designed to inspire fear in their enemies. Behind her, the bridge crew of the Defiance worked with quiet efficiency, their movements precise and unhurried. There was no panic, no desperation in their actions. If anything, they seemed almost eager. "Open a channel," Elena said. The main screen flickered, and suddenly, Admiral Crothven's massive form filled the display. The Draconian Admiral was even larger than most of his species, his scales a deep crimson that indicated his battle-ready state. Behind him, The bridge of his flagship bustled with activity as his crew prepared for what they expected to be a very brief engagement. "Human Admiral," Crothvin rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I am Admiral Crothvin of the Draconian Imperial Navy, commander of the 47th Battle Fleet. You have one opportunity to surrender your vessels and withdraw from this system. Refuse, and we will demonstrate why 43 worlds have fallen before draconian might." Elena stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that would have been familiar to anyone who had seen Ambassador Chen's performance before the Council 3 weeks earlier. Like the Ambassador, she wore the simple dark blue uniform of the Terran Federation, unadorned except for the small silver stars that marked her rank. Unlike the elaborate battle dress of other species' military leaders, there was nothing impressive about her appearance, which was exactly how humanity preferred it. "Admiral Crothvin," she replied, her voice calm and measured. "I am Admiral Elena Vasquez of the Terran Federation Navy. This system belongs to humanity by right of settlement and development. Your presence here constitutes an act of war against the Terran Federation." Crothvin's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. "War? Child, this is not war. This is pest control. Your pathetic fleet consists of what, 30 ships? Against 200 draconian vessels? Even if your weapons could penetrate our shields, which they cannot, you are outnumbered by more than 6 to 1. 7 to 1, actually," Elena corrected with surprising mildness. "Your intelligence was slightly off." The draconian admiral's scales darkened with irritation. "Surrender now, and your crews will be permitted to evacuate to the planet's surface before we claim this system for the Empire. Continue this farce, and we will crack your ships open like eggs and scatter their contents across the void." Elena was quiet for a moment, studying the alien admiral with the same intense focus that a scientist might use to examine an interesting specimen. Around her, the bridge crew continued their preparations, their movements unhurried despite the overwhelming enemy force bearing down on them. "Admiral Crothvin," she finally said, "before we proceed, I'm curious about something. In your 43 conquests, how many species actually fought back?" The question seemed to catch the Draconian off guard. "What does that matter? Humor me." Crothvin's tail lashed behind him, a sign of growing impatience among his people. "Most species possess enough intelligence to recognize futility when they see it. Of the 43 worlds we have claimed, perhaps 10 offered any meaningful resistance. And how long did those battles last? The longest was 6 hours. Most were over in less than 2. The Admiral's voice carried a note of pride. "Draconian battle doctrine is designed for swift, decisive victory. We do not believe in prolonged engagements." Elena nodded thoughtfully. 6 hours. That's interesting. And in all those battles, did any enemy ever manage to damage a draconian capital ship significantly enough to force it out of the engagement? Now Crothvin's scales were shifting toward black, a dangerous sign among his species. "What are you implying, human?" "I'm not implying anything," Elena replied. "I'm simply trying to understand your frame of reference. You see, the thing about reputation is that it's only as good as the quality of opponents who built it. If you've spent a century fighting enemies who surrender quickly or possess inferior technology, then your reputation might not accurately reflect your actual capabilities." The silence that followed was heavy with threat. When Crothvin spoke again, his voice carried the promise of violence. "Are you suggesting that the Draconian Imperial Navy is anything less than the finest military force in the galaxy?" Elena's expression remained perfectly neutral. "I'm suggesting that you're about to find out." She gestured to Commander Zhang. "Close the channel." The screen went dark, leaving the bridge of the Defiance in relative quiet. Outside, the Draconian fleet began to move, their formation shifting as they prepared for their attack run. It was a thing of terrible beauty, 200 warships moving in perfect coordination, their weapons charging as they approached optimal firing range. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Torres from the tactical station, "enemy fleet is beginning their attack approach. Estimated time to weapon range, for minutes." Elena turned to face her crew. These were men and women she had served with for years, people who had trained together, fought together, and trusted each other with their lives. Looking at their faces now, she saw no fear, no uncertainty. Instead, she saw something that the Draconians couldn't possibly understand: the quiet confidence of people who had been underestimated their entire careers and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. "All stations, this is Admiral Vasquez," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the ship through the internal communication system. "For 50 years, humanity has been dismissed by our galactic neighbors as weak, primitive, and irrelevant. They have mocked our restraint, laughed at our diplomacy, and treated our desire for peace as evidence of cowardice. Today, we remind the galaxy why our ancestors spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war before they ever reached for the stars." She paused, letting her words sink in. Around the bridge, her officers straightened in their chairs, their hands moving to their controls with practiced ease. "The Draconian Empire believes this will be pest control," she continued. "They believe their reputation and their numbers make victory inevitable. They believe they are facing the same kind of weak opposition they have conquered for the past century." Elena's voice hardened, taking on an edge that spoke of steel beneath silk. "They are wrong. Today, we show them what happens when a predator species decides to stop pretending to be prey. All ships, implement Battle Plan Omega. Authorization Vasquez Alpha 7. Execute on my mark." Around the Defiance, the small human fleet began to move. To Draconian observers, the movement would have looked like a desperate attempt at evasive maneuvers, 30 small ships scattering before the approaching juggernaut like minnows fleeing a shark. The formation appeared to have no tactical coherence, no strategic purpose beyond the instinctive desire to avoid destruction. It was exactly what the Draconians expected to see. "Enemy vessels are breaking formation," reported the tactical officer on Crothvin's flagship. "They appear to be attempting to scatter." The Draconian admiral's laugh rumbled through his bridge. "Of course they are. No species can maintain discipline in the face of certain death. Target the largest vessels first. We'll destroy their command structure, and the rest will surrender quickly enough." What Crothvin couldn't see, what none of the Draconian sensors could detect, was the subtle dance that the human ships were actually performing. Each vessel moved according to a carefully choreographed plan that had been developed over decades by strategists who understood that in any conflict between David and Goliath, David's advantages lay not in strength, but in speed, cunning, and the willingness to fight dirty. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Draconian fleet reached optimal firing range and launched their opening salvo. Hundreds of plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes streaked across space toward the scattered human vessels, weapons powerful enough to vaporize any ship they struck. It should have been a massacre. Instead, something impossible happened. The human ships simply weren't there anymore. "Report," Crothvin bellowed as his weapons officers stared at their displays in confusion. "All targets have vanished from our sensors," his tactical officer replied, his voice tight with disbelief. "Sensors show empty space where the human vessels should be." "Impossible. Ships cannot simply disappear." "Sir, we're detecting massive gravimetric distortions throughout the engagement zone. The readings are unlike anything in our database." On the bridge of the Defiance, Elena watched the Draconian fleet's confusion with grim satisfaction. Around her ship, space itself seemed to bend and twist as the gravimetric field generators came online. To external sensors, the effect made the human vessels effectively invisible, their electromagnetic signatures scattered and confused by the manipulation of local spacetime. "Stealth field holding steady," reported Lieutenant Torres. "Draconian sensors are completely blind." Elena nodded. The gravimetric stealth technology had been humanity's most closely guarded secret for 20 years, developed in hidden research facilities and tested only in the deepest regions of human space. It was one of many technologies that humanity had kept hidden while building their reputation as a peaceful, technologically inferior species. "Time to show them what else we've been working on," Elena said. "All ships, weapons free. Target their command vessels first." What happened next would be studied by military strategists for centuries to come. The human ships reappeared on Draconian sensors, but not where the enemy expected them to be. Instead of the scattered formation that had seemingly fled in panic, the human fleet had used their stealth capabilities to position themselves in perfect ambush positions throughout the Draconian formation. The weapons that erupted from the human vessels were unlike anything the Draconians had encountered before. Instead of the crude kinetic projectiles and primitive explosives that galactic intelligence reported, the human ships unleashed torrents of coherent energy that sliced through Draconian shields as if they didn't exist. Impossible, Crothven roared as reports flooded in from throughout his fleet. Human weapons cannot penetrate our shields. But they were penetrating them, with devastating effect. The energy beams that lanced out from the human ships were based on principles that the rest of the galaxy hadn't even theorized. Weapons that had been developed by a species that understood that survival often depended on developing better ways to kill your enemies before they killed you. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, his voice thick with disbelief. "The Draconian Vengeance is reporting catastrophic damage to their primary systems. They're requesting immediate assistance." Crothven turned to see one of his capital ships listing badly, atmosphere streaming from dozens of hull breaches. How was it possible? The Vengeance was one of the most powerful vessels in the Imperial fleet, protected by shields that could withstand the bombardment of an entire planetary defense grid. "All ships, concentrate fire on the human vessels," he commanded. "Show me these insects." But targeting the human ships proved nearly impossible. They moved like nothing the Draconians had ever encountered, their vessels dancing through space with an agility that defied understanding. When Draconian weapons did manage to lock onto a human ship, their target would vanish again into the gravimetric distortions, only to reappear moments later in an entirely different position. "Admiral," Elena said calmly as she watched another Draconian capital ship begin to list helplessly, "you wanted to know how long our battles usually last." She gestured to the tactical display, where the symbols representing Draconian vessels were winking out with terrifying regularity. "The answer is, as long as we want them to." The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in chaos. Representatives from 47 species filled the crystal chamber, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief, fear, and demand for answers. At the center of it all, High Counselor Rathmok slammed his massive fist repeatedly against the curved table, trying to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. "The chair recognizes Ambassador Esikatar of the Draconian Empire," Rathmok finally managed to bellow over the noise. The Draconian representative rose slowly, his massive frame somehow diminished from the proud figure who had threatened humanity just 3 weeks earlier. His scales, normally a brilliant crimson that spoke of confidence and aggression, had faded to a dull brown that indicated deep shock and psychological trauma among his people. "Honored counselors," Esikatar began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Draconian Empire formally requests council intervention in our territorial dispute with the Terran Federation." The chamber erupted again. Counselor Vextar's 4 eyes bulged from his head as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "Intervention? You're the ones who invoked the territorial acquisition protocols. You claimed you would take their worlds by force. That was before." Esikatar's voice trailed off, his scaled hands trembling as he consulted a data tablet. "Before we learned the true nature of human military capability." Zilthara, the Quillari representative, leaned forward in her moisture-controlled seat. "Ambassador Esikatar, according to our intelligence networks, the Draconian 47th Battle Fleet engaged a small human force at New Geneva 4 days ago. Our sources indicate it should have been a routine conquest. What exactly happened?" For a long moment, Esikatar said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a hollowness that chilled every representative in the chamber. "The 47th Battle Fleet no longer exists." The silence that followed was absolute. 200 Draconian capital ships, gone. It was impossible. The 47th was one of the most powerful military formations in galactic history, commanded by Admiral Crothven, one of the most successful military leaders of his generation. "Explain," Rathmok demanded, his own voice now carrying a note of uncertainty that he had never displayed before. Esikatar activated a holographic projector, filling the air above the council table with a 3-dimensional recreation of the New Geneva system. The 47th Fleet arrived at New Geneva with standard conquest protocols. "We detected 30 human vessels in the system, standard frigate and destroyer-class ships according to our intelligence assessments." Admiral Crothvin offered the humans an opportunity to surrender. The hologram showed the positions of both fleets at the beginning of the engagement, the massive draconian formation dwarfing the scattered human vessels. They refused. Esikatar continued. Admiral Crothvin ordered the attack. The hologram began to move, showing the draconian fleet advancing while the human ships appeared to scatter in panic. It was exactly what every representative in the chamber would have expected to see. Inferior forces fleeing before superior firepower. What happened next? Esikatar said, his voice dropping even lower. Defies all known principles of galactic warfare. The hologram shifted, and, suddenly, the human ships vanished entirely from the display. Where 30 vessels had been moments before, there was now only empty space. Stealth technology, Counselor Vextar said dismissively. Several species have developed limited cloaking capabilities. It's impressive, but hardly. This was not cloaking, Setar interrupted, his scales flickering between brown and black. Our sensors detected massive gravimetric distortions throughout the engagement zone. The humans somehow manipulated space-time itself to hide their vessels. But that's not the worst part. The hologram continued to play, and the assembled representatives watched in growing horror as draconian ships began to explode throughout their formation. The human vessels reappeared, but not where they had been before. Instead, they had somehow repositioned themselves in perfect ambush positions, their weapons already firing. Their weapons cut through our shields like they weren't there. Setar continued, his voice becoming mechanical as he recited facts his mind still couldn't fully accept. Capital ships that had withstood bombardments from entire planetary defense grids were disabled in seconds. Ships that had conquered worlds fell to human frigates that shouldn't have possessed enough firepower to scratch their hulls. The hologram showed the systematic destruction of the draconian fleet with terrifying efficiency. Human ships moved through space with impossible agility, their weapons reaching out to strike with surgical precision. One by one, the pride of the Draconian Empire was reduced to drifting wreckage. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. Esikatar finished. 17 minutes to destroy 200 capital ships and their support vessels. Admiral Crothvin's flagship was the last to fall. His final transmission was instructive. High Counselor Rathmok leaned forward, his massive frame tense with concentration. What did he say? Esikatar touched his data tablet, and, suddenly, Admiral Crothvin's voice filled the chamber. The recording was filled with static and the sounds of battle, but the Draconian Admiral's words were clear enough. They're not using standard weapons. Crothvin's voice crackled through the speakers. The energy signatures don't match anything in our database. It's like they're firing concentrated starlight. Our shields can't. The sound of explosions interrupted him. How are they moving like that? Ships can't accelerate that fast without killing their crews. It's impossible. Another explosion, closer this time. Sir, we've lost main power. They're targeting our critical systems with surgical precision. It's like they know exactly where to hit us. A pause. Then, Crothvin's voice again, quieter now and filled with something that sounded like wonder. They're not trying to destroy us quickly. They're taking us apart piece by piece. This isn't a battle. It's a demonstration. The final transmission was barely audible. Tell the Empire, we didn't lose to a superior force. We lost to a superior species. The recording ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. It was Counselor Vextar who finally found his voice. You're telling us that 30 human ships destroyed the 47th battle fleet in 17 minutes? It's impossible. Our combined intelligence services have been monitoring human military capabilities for decades. They possess no such technology. That, said a new voice from the chamber's entrance, is because you've been monitoring the wrong things. Every head in the chamber turned to see Ambassador Sarah Chun walking calmly down the central aisle. She moved with the same controlled precision she had displayed 3 weeks earlier. But now there was something different about her presence. Where before she had seemed like a lone figure surrounded by more powerful enemies, now she seemed to carry an aura of quiet menace that made even the largest council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ambassador Chun, High Counselor Rathmok said carefully, this is an emergency session. The Terran Federation was not invited to participate. Sarah stopped at the center of the chamber, in exactly the same spot where she had stood when the Draconians had threatened her people. Article 15 of the Council Charter provides for any member species to address emergency sessions that directly concern their interests. Since this emergency session appears to be about humanity's response to Draconian aggression, I believe our interests are quite directly concerned. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives who no longer seemed quite so eager to dismiss her presence. Now then, she continued, Councillor Vextar raised an interesting point about intelligence monitoring. You've all been watching our shipping manifests, counting our military vessels, and cataloging our weapons systems. Very thorough. Unfortunately, you made the same mistake that intelligence agencies have been making for thousands of years. Which is? Rathmok asked. You assumed that what you could see was all there was to see. Sarah gestured, and a holographic display appeared above the council table, showing star charts of human-controlled space. For 50 years, humanity has pursued a policy of peaceful expansion and diplomatic engagement with our galactic neighbors. We have been the model citizens of the galactic community, respectful, cooperative, and restrained. The star chart zoomed in on specific systems, highlighting what appeared to be industrial installations and research facilities. What your intelligence services cataloged as mining operations and research stations were somewhat more than they appeared, Sarah continued. For example, this facility on Kepler 442b, which your reports listed as a xenobiology research station, was actually one of our primary weapons development centers. The hologram shifted to show detailed schematics of the weapons that had devastated the Draconian fleet. The energy weapons you witnessed are based on controlled stellar fusion, essentially handheld stars that can be focused into coherent beams. We call them Sunfire weapons. They've been in development for 30 years. Gasps and whispers filled the chamber. The technology was beyond anything the Council had imagined possible. This facility on Wolf 359, Sarah continued, highlighting another system, which you classified as an agricultural research station, was actually developing the gravimetric manipulation technology that our ships use to achieve stealth and enhanced maneuverability. More schematics appeared, showing the principles behind technology that seemed to bend the laws of physics themselves. But, Ambassador Chan, Zilthara interjected, if humanity possessed such advanced technology, why hide it? Why allow other species to believe you were primitive and weak? Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that made the Quillari representative sink back in her chair. Because the best defense against aggression is to be so clearly not worth attacking that potential enemies don't bother to try, she replied. For 50 years, we have successfully convinced the galaxy that humanity was too weak, too primitive, and too peaceful to represent any kind of threat. As a result, we have enjoyed 50 years of peace to develop, to grow, and to prepare. Prepare for what? Rathmok asked. For the day when someone would force us to stop pretending to be harmless. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species suddenly found themselves re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about the small, quiet species from the edge of the galaxy. The Draconian Empire made the choice to threaten human worlds, Sarah continued. They were convinced that their reputation and their numbers made victory inevitable. They believed they were facing weak prey. She paused, letting her words sink in. They discovered instead that they had awakened something that had been sleeping by choice, not by necessity. The destruction of the 47th Battle Fleet was not a victory. It was a message. What message? S.E.K. Tar whispered, his scales now a sickly gray color. Sarah turned to face him directly, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on every being in the chamber. That humanity's 50 years of restraint should never have been mistaken for 50 years of weakness. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry timber. Within hours of the emergency council session, every major news network, intelligence agency, and military command was broadcasting the same impossible story. Humanity had revealed itself to be far more than the peaceful, primitive species the galaxy had believed them to be. Admiral Korthak of the Gorvani Imperial Fleet stood on the command deck of his flagship, the World Breaker, staring at tactical displays that showed the recorded destruction of the Draconian 47th Battle Fleet. He had watched the engagement analysis 17 times now, and each viewing only raised more questions about what humanity was truly capable of. Admiral, his tactical officer reported, "We've completed the analysis of the human weapon signatures. The energy output readings are disturbing." Korthak's purple hide was marked with the ritual scars of 30 successful conquests, each one a testament to his strategic brilliance and the overwhelming might of the Gorvani war machine. He had spent his entire career believing that military success came from superior numbers, better armor, and more powerful weapons. The humans had just demonstrated that all three advantages could be rendered meaningless by superior technology and tactics. "Show me," he rumbled. The tactical display shifted to show energy readings from the human weapons. "Sir, the peak output of a single human Sunfire weapon exceeds the total energy generation capacity of most capital ships. They're somehow containing and focusing stellar-level energies in weapons platforms that couldn't possibly generate that much power on their own." Korthak studied the readings with growing unease. "What about their movement patterns? Ships can't accelerate that rapidly without liquefying their crews." "That's what we thought, sir. But analysis suggests they may have developed some form of inertial compensation that goes far beyond anything in our technology base. Our scientists are calling it impossible, but the evidence is right there in the sensor logs." The admiral turned away from the displays to gaze out at his fleet. 40 capital ships hung in space around the world breaker, each one a monument to Gorvani military might. Just hours ago, he would have considered this force capable of conquering any system in the galaxy. Now he found himself wondering if 40 ships would be enough to defeat even 10 human vessels. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from High Command." The main screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Fleet Marshal Vaktar, Supreme Commander of all Gorvani military forces. The Marshal's ceremonial armor gleamed under the lights of the command chamber, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Admiral Korthak," the Marshal began without preamble, "you will immediately return to Gorvani Prime for emergency strategic planning sessions. All fleet operations beyond our core territories are suspended until further notice." Korthak felt his world shift beneath him. The Gorvani Empire had not suspended offensive operations in over 2 centuries. "Marshal, are we expecting human retaliation for our territorial claims?" "Admiral," Vaktar replied grimly, "we're now operating under the assumption that human retaliation is both inevitable and potentially catastrophic. The intelligence briefings on their hidden capabilities suggest that every assumption we've made about galactic military balance was wrong." The transmission ended, leaving Korthak alone with thoughts that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. For the first time in his career, he found himself wondering if the Gorvani Empire might have bitten off more than it could chew. Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy as news of humanity's true capabilities spread. In the crystalline cities of the Zephyrian Collective, emergency sessions were being called to reassess territorial policies that had been based on the assumption of human weakness. On the water worlds of the Quillari Republic, intelligence analysts worked around the clock to determine how badly they had underestimated the species they had dismissed as irrelevant. But nowhere was the impact more profound than in the highest levels of the Galactic Council itself. High Counselor Rathmok stood alone in his private chambers, studying holographic projections of every known human colony and outpost. For 40 years, he had viewed human expansion as a minor annoyance, a young species slowly spreading across empty systems while the real powers of the galaxy shaped galactic politics. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that humanity had been deliberately allowing itself to be underestimated while building capabilities that could challenge the established order. A soft chime announced an incoming communication. "Enter," Rathmok called. Counselor Vextar scuttled into the chamber, his insectoid features twisted with an anxiety that his species rarely displayed. "High Counselor, I've just received the preliminary analysis of human military installations from our intelligence services. And it's worse than we thought." Vextar activated a holographic display that showed human space with dozens of previously unknown installations highlighted in red. "Our analysts estimate that for every facility we knew about, There are at least three that we completely missed. The humans have been building a shadow infrastructure for decades. Rathmok studied the display with growing concern. What kind of installations? Weapons research facilities, advanced manufacturing centers, what appear to be strategic command bunkers, and, most disturbing of all, shipyards that are far larger than anything we detected before. The High Counselor's massive hands clenched into fists. How many ships could they build? That's the problem, we don't know. Based on the size of these hidden shipyards, they could have been producing vessels for decades without our knowledge. The 30 ships that destroyed the Draconian fleet might represent less than 10% of their actual military capability. For the first time in his political career, Rathmok felt genuine fear. The Galactic Council's power had always been based on the military might of its major members. If humanity possessed technology and numbers far beyond what anyone had estimated, the entire galactic balance of power was in question. Has there been any response from other council members? The Draconian Empire has withdrawn all their fleets to defensive positions around their core worlds, Vextar reported. The Gorvani are recalling their expeditionary forces, and the Quillari have suspended all territorial expansion operations. Everyone is waiting to see what humanity does next. And what are the humans doing? That's the most unsettling part. Nothing. Their fleets have returned to normal patrol patterns. Their diplomats are requesting scheduled meetings to discuss post-conflict territorial adjustments. They're acting as if the complete destruction of a major galactic fleet was just another diplomatic negotiation. Rathmok turned back to the holographic display, studying the red markers that indicated previously unknown human installations. Each one represented a failure of galactic intelligence services, a blindness that had allowed humanity to prepare for this moment while their enemies remained ignorant. Schedule a private meeting with Ambassador Chun, he finally said. It's time to find out what humanity really wants. The meeting took place 2 days later in a secured chamber deep within the council complex. Rathmok had chosen the location carefully, a small, windowless room with minimal decoration and no recording devices. What he had to discuss with the human ambassador was not meant for public consumption. Sarah Chun arrived precisely on time, dressed in the same simple blue uniform she had worn to every council session. She took the seat across from Rathmok without ceremony, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she waited for him to speak. Ambassador Chun, Rathmok began, I believe it's time for humanity and the council to have a frank discussion about the future of galactic politics. I agree completely, Sarah replied. What did you want to discuss? Rathmok had prepared for this conversation for hours, planning arguments and negotiations that would allow the council to maintain some semblance of its traditional authority. Looking at the small human woman across from him now, he realized that all his preparation had been based on assumptions that no longer applied. Let's dispense with diplomatic niceties, he said bluntly. How powerful is humanity really? Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. Powerful enough. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you need, she replied. For 50 years, humanity has been content to exist on the margins of galactic politics. We've followed council protocols, respected territorial agreements, and sought peaceful solutions to disputes. Nothing about our fundamental nature has changed. Rathmok leaned forward, his massive frame dwarfing the human ambassador. But your capabilities have changed. The question is, what do you intend to do with them? Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in the air between them seemed to shift. High Counselor, are you asking whether humanity intends to use its military capabilities to threaten other species? I'm asking whether the Council needs to prepare for a new galactic war. The silence that followed stretched for long seconds. When Sarah finally spoke, her words carried a weight that made Rathmok sink back in his chair. The Council needs to prepare for a new galactic reality, she said. For 2,000 years, galactic politics has been based on the assumption that military might makes right. Species have conquered each other, claimed territory through force, and maintained power through the threat of violence. She paused, letting her words sink in. Humanity has just demonstrated that the strongest military force in the galaxy can be neutralized in 17 minutes. The question isn't whether we're going to change galactic politics. We already have. The question is whether the existing power structures are going to adapt to the new reality or try to fight against it. Rathmok felt the foundations of his worldview shifting beneath him. "What are you proposing?" "We're proposing," Sarah said, "that the galaxy might be ready for a different approach to interspecies relations. One based on cooperation rather than conquest, on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, and on respect rather than fear. And if the established powers refuse to accept this new approach." Sarah's smile was small and cold. "Then, they'll discover what the Draconian Empire learned at New Geneva." As the meeting ended and Sarah Chun walked calmly out of the chamber, High Counselor Rathmok was left alone with the realization that the galaxy had fundamentally changed forever. Humanity had stopped pretending to be weak, and no one was quite sure what that meant for the rest of them. 6 months after the Battle of New Geneva, the Galactic Council chamber looked much the same as it always had. The same crystalline walls reflected the same artificial suns, and representatives from 47 species still gathered around the same curved table to debate the future of galactic civilization. But the conversations taking place within those familiar walls had changed in fundamental ways. "The motion before the Council," High Counselor Rathmok announced, "is the formal adoption of the Terran Accords on interspecies relations. All those in favor, hands, claws, tentacles, and appendages of every description rose throughout the chamber. The vote was unanimous, something that had never happened in the 2,000-year history of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Sarah Chun rose from her seat to address the assembly. 6 months ago, she had stood in this same spot, while representatives from across the galaxy mocked humanity's request for territorial rights. Today, those same representatives listened to her words with the careful attention usually reserved for species that possess the power to end civilizations. "The Terran Federation is pleased to see the unanimous adoption of these accords," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had become her trademark. "For too long, galactic civilization has been built on the principle that might makes right. Today, we begin the process of building something better." The accords themselves were revolutionary by galactic standards. They established binding protocols for peaceful dispute resolution, prohibited territorial expansion through military conquest, and created enforcement mechanisms that would actually function. Most importantly, they were backed by the implicit threat of human military intervention against any species that chose to violate them. Counselor Vextar, who had once laughed at human pretensions to relevance, now spoke with the careful deference of someone who had seen what happened to those who underestimated humanity. "Ambassador Chun," he said, "the Zephyrian Collective wishes to formally thank the Terran Federation for their assistance in resolving our border dispute with the Gorvani Empire. The peaceful resolution that your mediators achieved saved both our species from what could have been a devastating conflict." It was true. 3 months after New Geneva, the Zephyrians and Gorvani had found themselves on the brink of war over mining rights in a contested system. Traditional council mediation had failed, as it usually did, and both sides had begun mobilizing their fleets for what promised to be a bloody conflict. Then, humanity had quietly offered to mediate the dispute. The negotiations had lasted exactly 4 hours. At the end of that time, both sides had agreed to a resource-sharing arrangement that was so obviously fair and beneficial that they wondered why they hadn't thought of it themselves. No threats had been made, no military force had been displayed, but both the Zephyrians and Gorvani were acutely aware that the species offering to mediate their dispute possessed the demonstrated ability to destroy either of their fleets in a matter of minutes. "The Gorvani Empire," rumbled Admiral Korthak, who now served as his species' primary diplomatic representative, "also wishes to express gratitude for human assistance in our recent negotiations with the Draconian Empire regarding reparations for their territorial violations." That had been an even more delicate situation. The Draconian Empire, still reeling from the loss of their entire 47th Battle Fleet, had been slow to acknowledge that their aggressive expansion policies violated the new accords. Several species had demanded massive reparations for decades of draconian conquest. The situation had been rapidly escalating toward galactic war when humanity had once again offered to mediate. The solution they had proposed was elegant in its simplicity. The Draconian Empire would provide technological assistance, and infrastructure development to the worlds they had previously conquered, effectively paying reparations in the form of improved living conditions for their former victims. In exchange, no punitive actions would be taken against draconian core worlds, and the Empire would be allowed to maintain its territorial integrity as long as it ceased all aggressive expansion. The agreement had been signed within a week. No one had wanted to discover what would happen if they refused the reasonable solution offered by the species that had demonstrated its ability to end interstellar conflicts in 17 minutes. The Council recognizes Ambassador Esikatar of the Draconian Empire, Rathmok announced. The Draconian representative rose slowly, his scales still showing the dull brown coloration that his species exhibited when dealing with trauma or severe stress. 6 months had not been enough time for the Draconian Empire to fully process the implications of their defeat at New Geneva. The Draconian Empire, Esikatar said carefully, wishes to formally acknowledge that our previous territorial policies were incompatible with peaceful galactic coexistence. We pledge our full cooperation with the enforcement mechanisms established by the Terran Accords. It was a complete reversal of everything the Draconian Empire had stood for over the past century. Their entire identity had been built around military conquest and the subjugation of weaker species. Now they found themselves committed to a policy of peaceful cooperation, not out of any moral epiphany, but out of the simple recognition that the alternative might be extinction. Sarah Chun nodded acknowledgement of the Draconian statement, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Humanity had learned long ago that lasting peace required more than just the threat of overwhelming force. It required the creation of systems that made cooperation more profitable than conflict. The Terran Federation believes that the Draconian Empire's commitment to peaceful development will serve as an example to other species who may still believe that military expansion is a viable path to prosperity, she said diplomatically. What she didn't say, but what everyone in the chamber understood, was that the Draconian Empire's commitment to peace wasn't entirely voluntary. Human monitoring stations now existed throughout Draconian space, observing and recording every military movement. The official designation was Technological Assistance Posts, but their real purpose was to ensure that the Empire never again assembled the kind of military force that could threaten other species. The same monitoring systems had been quietly installed throughout the territories of every major galactic power. Species that had spent centuries building vast fleets for conquest now found themselves encouraged to redirect their military production toward peaceful purposes. The encouragement was gentle but persistent, and always backed by the implicit understanding that failure to cooperate might result in the kind of rapid military intervention that had befallen the Draconian 47th Battle Fleet. The Council recognizes the representative from the Outer Rim Coalition, Rathmok announced. A small, reptilian creature rose from one of the peripheral seats. The coalition represented 47 minor species that had previously existed on the margins of galactic politics, too weak to defend themselves and too poor to matter to the major powers. The coalition wishes to thank the Terran Federation for their assistance in establishing the Mutual Defense Compact, the representative said in a voice that trembled with emotion. For the first time in our species' histories, we can focus on development and growth instead of simply trying to survive. The Mutual Defense Compact was perhaps humanity's most brilliant diplomatic achievement. Rather than trying to police the entire galaxy themselves, they had organized the minor species into a mutual defense alliance. Any attack on one coalition member would trigger response from all coalition members, and, more importantly, from humanity itself. The compact had transformed galactic politics overnight. Species that had spent centuries as prey animals, constantly watching for predators, now found themselves free to pursue scientific advancement, cultural development, and economic growth. The major powers, meanwhile, discovered that their traditional sources of easy conquest had suddenly become defended by the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The Terran Federation is pleased to see the coalition's continued prosperity, Sarah replied. We believe that galactic civilization is strongest when all species are free to develop their unique potentials. As the formal session wound down, representatives began filing out of the chamber in small groups. engaged in the kind of cooperative discussions that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Where once there had been scheming and plotting and the constant threat of military action, now there were joint development projects, scientific exchanges, and peaceful trade negotiations. High Counselor Rathmok remained behind as the chamber emptied, studying the holographic displays that showed the current state of galactic civilization. Every indicator pointed to unprecedented peace and prosperity. Territorial disputes were being resolved through mediation rather than warfare. Military spending across the galaxy was at its lowest level in recorded history. Scientific and cultural advancement was accelerating as species redirected resources from conquest to development. Impressive, isn't it? Sarah Chun said quietly, approaching the High Counselor's position. Rathmok turned to face her, his massive frame no longer seeming quite so imposing. I'll admit that the results have exceeded our most optimistic projections. Galactic civilization has never been more peaceful or prosperous. And yet you're troubled by something. The High Counselor was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Ambassador Chun, may I speak frankly? Please do. 6 months ago, I was terrified that humanity would use its military superiority to conquer the galaxy. Instead, you've created a system that has brought unprecedented peace and cooperation to our civilization. You've turned former enemies into allies, protected the weak from the strong, and established frameworks for lasting prosperity. Sarah waited for him to continue. But you've also made it clear that all of this exists at your sufferance, Rathmok continued. The peace we enjoy, the cooperation we've achieved, the protection that smaller species now enjoy, all of it depends on humanity's continued willingness to maintain the system you've created. What happens if humanity changes its mind? What happens if you decide that the galaxy would be better off under direct human rule? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, gazing out at the holographic display of galactic civilization. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that spoke of decisions made long ago and principles that would not be easily abandoned. High Counselor, do you know what humanity learned during our thousands of years of history before we reached the stars? Tell me. We learned that lasting peace cannot be built on fear alone. Yes, the current system exists because we have the power to enforce it. But the real foundation of galactic peace isn't our military capability. It's the fact that cooperation has proven to be more profitable than conquest for every species in the galaxy. She gestured to the displays showing trade networks, scientific exchanges, and joint development projects that spanned dozens of star systems. The Zephyrians have achieved more technological advancement in 6 months of peaceful cooperation than they did in the previous century of military expansion. The Gorvani Empire has seen unprecedented economic growth as they've redirected their military spending toward infrastructure development. Even the Draconian Empire is discovering that building worlds is more rewarding than conquering them. Sarah turned to face Rathmok directly. Humanity's role isn't to rule the galaxy. It's to protect the system that allows every species to reach its full potential. And as long as that system continues to work, as long as cooperation remains more profitable than conquest, humanity will continue to protect it. And if cooperation stops being profitable, Sarah's smile was small but warm, then we'll find ways to make it profitable again. That's what humanity does. We solve problems. As she walked away, leaving Rathmok alone in the chamber, the High Counselor found himself contemplating the strange turn that galactic history had taken. For 2,000 years, the galaxy had been shaped by species that sought to conquer and dominate. Now it was being shaped by a species that seemed genuinely committed to the idea that everyone could win. It was, he realized, a revolutionary concept in galactic politics. And it was working. Outside the council chamber, across thousands of star systems, billions of beings went about their daily lives in peace and security that their ancestors could never have imagined. Former enemies worked side by side on scientific projects that would benefit all species. Trade fleets moved safely through space without fear of piracy or territorial aggression. Worlds that had once lived in constant fear of conquest now focused on art, science, and the pursuit of knowledge. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving so many different species ever could be. There were still disputes, still disagreements, still the occasional species that tested the boundaries of the new order. But each time such challenges arose, they were met with the patient, methodical response that had become humanity's trademark. A reasonable solution backed by the quiet certainty that unreasonable alternatives would not be tolerated. The galaxy had learned to respect humanity not because they were conquerors, but because they were protectors. Not because they demanded submission, but because they offered partnership. Not because they threatened destruction, but because they delivered results. And in the deepest archives of human space, in facilities that even now remained hidden from galactic intelligence services, engineers and scientists continued their work on technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Not because humanity sought ever greater military power, but because they understood that the price of peace was eternal vigilance. The galaxy had mocked humanity's restraint, mistaking it for weakness. They had learned too late that restraint backed by overwhelming capability wasn't weakness at all. It was wisdom. And wisdom, as the galaxy was discovering, was the most powerful force in the universe.